Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com with a discussion about consensus science. Consensus science is based on the belief that everyone else is smarter than you are, and if enough people believe something, then it must be true. This statement from the American Association for the Advancement of Science is a classic consensus science declaration. The American Association for the Advancement of Science has reaffirmed the position of its board of directors and the leaders of 18 respected organizations who concluded, based on multiple lines of scientific evidence, that global climate change caused by human activities is now underway and it's a growing threat to society. What they're saying in this statement is that huge numbers of very respected people believe something and therefore it must be true. Earth needs fewer people to beat the climate crisis, scientists say. More than 11,000 experts signed an emergency declaration warning that energy, food, and reproduction must change immediately. Wow, so 11,000 experts say you have to give up your car and your reliable source of energy, and we have to cut way back on Earth's population. So we know what the American Association for the Advancement of Science is saying now. Let's see what they said 100 years ago. This was their publication, Science Magazine, on October 7th, 1921. They were talking about race, character, and betterment and vigorous movement of race hygiene. 100 years later, race hygiene has a new name. It's now called ethnic cleansing. The consensus of scientists 100 years ago, based on their studies of evolution and genetics, had concluded that white Europeans were superior to other races. This theory was called eugenics and was ubiquitous through academia. Scientists had noticed that Europeans developed art, music, science, and theater, while people in many other parts of the world were still living very primitive lives. This led the academic community to believe that white Europeans were genetically superior to other races. The Eugenics Research Association was associated with the American Association for the Advancement of Science. By 1936, more than 60,000 forced sterilizations had been performed in the United States on mostly poor and often African American people. The Nazis, when proposing their own sterilization program, specifically noted the success of sterilization laws in California. The belief in white racial superiority was widespread through the academic community and led to all sorts of atrocities. After World War I, Japan proposed these words in the Treaty of Versailles. The equality of nations being a basic principle of the League of Nations, the high contracting parties agreed to accord as soon as possible to all alien nationals of states, members of the League, equal and just treatment in every respect, making no distinction either in law or in fact on account of their race or nationality. This seems like a pretty reasonable proposal by the Japanese, but the United States and Australia killed the Japanese proposal. By 1926, discrimination against Japanese people in California was so bad that they wanted to get out of the United States and move to Mexico. The hatred which Japanese people faced in America prior to World War II had a lot to do with the hostility that led to the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Eugenics was at the core of German National Socialism. They concluded, based on studies done in America and Europe, that Jewish people were genetically inferior. The German National Socialists didn't pull their ideas out of thin air. They were heavily supported by academics in both the United States and Europe. In 1921, the American Association for the Advancement of Science was promoting eugenics, but there were a lot of other things going on in the world as well. Millions of people in Europe, Russia, and Asia faced death from a record heat wave and drought. The New York Times said that Earth had a fever characterized by a worldwide heat wave of unusual length and intensity. They said that 2 million Koreans were starving in Manchuria owing to drought-ruined crops, drought kills fish in River Seine, and France suffers most severe drought in 47 years. And meanwhile, the Rhine and Moselle rivers were having their highest flood in 136 years. One of the deadliest floods in U.S. history occurred on June 3, 1921 in Pueblo, Colorado. It was reported that 1,500 people died in the flood. This is what downtown Pueblo, Colorado looked like on June 3, 1921. NASA used to show 1921 as the second hottest year on record in the United States. This was their 1999 version of the U.S. temperature graph. In a few minutes, I'll show you how that graph has since been altered. In 1922, the U.S. Weather Bureau reported a radical change in Arctic climatic conditions and hitherto unheard of high temperatures. They said, many old landmarks are so changed as to be unrecognizable. Where formerly great masses of ice were found, there are now often moraines, accumulations of earth and stones. At many points where glaciers formerly extended far into the sea, they have entirely disappeared. In 1923, glaciers in Glacier National Park were melting so quickly that scientists predicted they would be completely gone within 25 years, or by 1948. 100 years ago, the weather was very hot and it was also very extreme. Now let's fast forward 10 years to this week in 1931. On August 21st, 1931, China was experiencing the worst flood in history. Millions of people died when 50,000 square miles of China became inundated. At the same time, drought covered most of the United States, and many people in the U.S. were starving. 1931 brought the most widespread heat on record to the United States. 93% of the country reached 95 degrees Fahrenheit or 35 degrees Celsius sometime during the year. Compare that to this year, which has been the second lowest on record after 2014. Only 55% of the United States has gotten up to 95 degrees Fahrenheit sometime during the year. The area of the United States which is affected by high afternoon temperatures has plummeted over the last century. And besides the bad weather, something else was going on in 1931 in Germany. Germany's leading academics wrote a paper, 100 Scientists Against Einstein. Einstein responded with, if I'm wrong, why do they need 100 people? Why not just one person who can explain it? The 100 German scientists didn't base their paper on physics, rather they based it on eugenics. Einstein was a Jew, and the scientific consensus had determined that Jews were inferior genetically. By 1932, Einstein realized his life was in danger and he fled to the United States. In 1936, Einstein wrote a letter to President Roosevelt warning that the Germans were going to develop an atomic bomb and that the United States better develop one first. A number of Jewish scientists fled Germany, came to the United States, and helped build that bomb and defeat Germany. If those scientists had stayed in Germany, it's likely Germany would have developed the bomb first, and that would have been a huge catastrophe. Germany's eugenics program was largely inspired by America's eugenics program, and it self-destructed because they persecuted Jews. But the eugenics has never gone away. In 1969, the United Nations was openly talking about poisoning the food and water supply of third world countries. And 30 years ago, the United Nations magazine was saying that we must eliminate 350,000 people per day because carbon dioxide was going to destroy the planet. This is the same message which the scientific consensus is saying in the year 2021. So nothing's really changed over the last century. The scientific consensus still wants to wipe out large portions of the human race. Before I finish up, let's take a look at a few events which occurred on this date in history. 1886 was the most active hurricane year in the United States. Texas was hit by 4 hurricanes and Florida was hit by 3. On this date in 1886, the city of Indianola, Texas was wiped off the map permanently by a Category 4 hurricane. But even more interesting about August 20th, 1886 is that there was violent weather all over much of the United States, Canada, and Europe. On Wednesday, vessels were wrecked in Boston Harbor, and within a period of about 24 hours, there were phenomenal storms in New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Ohio, Indiana, Iowa, Missouri, Texas, and other states. In the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the steamers Serbia and Ethiopia encountered a hurricane. A gale and heavy rains put a stop to the rioting at Belfast. France suffered a hurricane, Berlin, Germany had a hot wave of unusual severity, and people in Russia were suffering from storms. It is noteworthy that on Wednesday morning, August 11th, the Democrat and Chronicle recorded the appearance of a very active disturbance on the sun, which came into view on Tuesday. Now let's take a look at August 20th, 1955. More than 2/3 of the United States was over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The red dots on this map show locations that were over 90 degrees Fahrenheit on August 20th, 1955, and the purple dots show places that were over 100 degrees. As you can see, August 20th, 1955 was an incredibly hot day. And that wasn't the only extreme weather on August 20th, 1955. The front page of the New York Times reported floods batter the Northeast, 73 killed, damage in billions, 4 states declare emergencies, rain set record, worst in Pennsylvania, Jersey, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. The raw temperature data from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration shows unequivocally that the United States was much hotter 90 years ago than it is now. But the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says scientific evidence for warming of the climate system is unequivocal. Temperature graphs from NASA used to show a cooling trend from the 1930s through the end of the 20th century, but they've since altered the data that turned the cooling trend into a warming trend. In 1974, global temperature graphs showed that 1970 was cooler than 1900. But that data has since been altered, and now government temperature graphs show a lot of warming prior to 1970. In 1974, everybody in the scientific community understood that Earth had cooled a lot since 1940, and they blamed droughts, floods, blizzards, tornadoes, typhoons, and hurricanes on the global cooling. But that cooling has since been erased and has been replaced by a consensus of graphs showing very similar warming. These different government agencies show identical temperatures from the year 1920, which is pretty remarkable because they have almost no daily temperature data for most of the Earth's surface from the year 1920. The error bars for the year 1920 would have to be huge, but somehow these different government agencies came up with exactly the same number. The only way this could happen would be if the different groups were colluding with each other to come up with the same number in order to create the appearance of consensus. Remember that in 1921 there was a worldwide heat wave of unusual length and intensity reported by the New York Times, and millions of people were starving from the record heat and drought. Yet that heat wave has completely disappeared. In 1923, the glaciers in Glacier National Park were melting so fast, experts predicted they would be gone by 1948. Yet the heat of 1923 has completely disappeared. In 1922, the U.S. Weather Bureau reported a radical change in Arctic climatic conditions, unheard of high temperatures, and massive loss of glacial ice. And yet the heat of 1922 has been completely erased by the scientific consensus. Scientific consensus is not about science, it's about pushing an agenda. Galileo said, "In questions of science, the authority of 1,000 isn't worth the humble reasoning of a single individual." Toto's been working for the past 13 years to give people the information they need to do the humble reasoning themselves. That's how science and democracy is supposed to operate, not being bullied by criminals in academia. You can visit Toto, Kyrie, and Caesar on the web at realclimatescience.com.
Welcome to Tucker Carlson's Happy Friday. We've learned a lot.